Hi everyone and welcome. Today we will learn how to pass information from a process to a form and vice versa, and how to configure conditional transitions between process blocks. In videos 5 and 6 we configured a process with two forms, where the first form contains a client table and the second one is empty. Now you can probably notice some changes in this process as compared to those previous videos. First of all, there is no script block. It was empty and we don't need it in this video. And second, the form's names have changed. Now they reflect the form's functionality. Remember that it is always recommended to name the objects you create in a meaningful way, so you can understand what they do. Let's consider the following task. We want to select a client from the table on the first form and see the selected client's data automatically displayed on the second form. As you might remember, all forms in this process have strict context. This means that they cannot access process attributes directly. Therefore, to complete this task, we have to configure information exchange between the process and the forms. For that, we will need to bind the attributes to each other. Let's look at the client table. Currently, when a client is selected from the table, this client is recorded to the client form attribute. A similar attribute, but called client process, was earlier created in the process. Now we need to bind these two attributes together. For that, select the form block and find its property called form instance initialization values. Click on the value field of this property. In the opened complex type editor, click Add to add a new line. On the left side, select the client form attribute. On the right side, you can specify either a UDML expression or a process attribute. In our case, it will be the client process attribute. As a result, we now have a binding between this form attribute and this process attribute. Save changes in the editor and then save the process diagram. Now let's move to the second form. First, let's add widgets that will display client data. For example, it can be a display field showing the client's last name, change its system name, and label. Next, let's create a form attribute. It will be a string attribute called lastNameForm. It is also necessary to mark it as an input attribute so that it can receive values from process attributes and pass values to process attributes. Save the attribute. Lastly, specify the newly created attribute in the value property of the display field. Save changes on the form and move back to the process. In the same way as before, configure the form instance initialization values property of the second form block. Add a new line, select the form attribute on the left, but this time we will specify not the whole process attribute on the right, but only one of its fields, last name. As a result, we will get the expression clientProcess.lastName. There is another way you could have configured this connection. For example, you could have created a form attribute clientForm that references the client type, then in the display field specify only one field of this attribute, clientForm.lastName, and then bind the clientForm attribute to the clientProcess attribute. Save the process diagram. The last thing we need to configure is a transition from the first form to the second form. For that, let's go to the first form and add a button to it. By clicking this button, we will be directed to the second form. Change its system name and label. Note that its property sendForm has a default value commit and submit. This means that when the button is clicked, we will leave this form and move further down the process. And right now, this is exactly what we need, so we will just leave this property unchanged. Save the form. Now let's test the new functionality in the form runner. Select a client from the table. Note that this client's last name has appeared in the display field below the table, which confirms that the selection procedure is working correctly. Now click the Next button. We move to the second form that displays the selected client's last name. This way, we have configured bindings between form attributes and process attributes and made sure that they are functioning properly. Let's have a look at the second form. In the process diagram, we can see that this form has two outgoing transitions, to the end of the process and back to the first form. Let's configure these transitions. For that, add two buttons on the second form. One of them will take us back to the first form, and the other one will lead us to the end of the process. Let's configure the first button. Change its system name and label. Note that the button widget has a property called Action Name. This is a special property that is linked to the default process attribute result. However, since this form has strict context and cannot access process attributes directly, we will have to configure this connection manually. For that, create a string attribute named result on the form. Mark it as input. Now, this result attribute is connected to the action name property of each button this form contains. In the action name property of the first button, specify the string value that will be assigned to the result form attribute when this button is clicked. For this button, this value will be back, because this is a transition that will lead us back to the first form. When the process has to decide which transition to follow, it will check the value recorded in the result attribute and follow the corresponding transition. Now let's configure the second button. This button will lead us to the end of the process. Change its name and label. In a similar way, in the action name property, specify the value that will be assigned to the result form attribute when this button is clicked. For this button, the value will be complete because it completes the process. Save the form and let's go back to the process. Now, in the second form block, we need to bind another form attribute to a process attribute. The newly created result form attribute to the result process attribute. Now, let's configure conditions based on which each transition should be followed. For that, select the first transition arrow and change the value of its condition type property from standard to conditional flow. As you can see, an additional field appears where we can set a transition condition. For this transition, we need to check whether the value of the result attribute is back. This way, the value of the result form attribute will be passed to the result process attribute, and if this value is back, which means if the first button was clicked, the process will follow this transition. In a similar way, we can configure the second transition, set the condition type property to conditional flow, and specify a condition. In this case, we need to check whether the value of the result attribute is complete. However, as we have only two transitions, we can set the condition type of the second transition to default flow. This means that when the process is about to leave the second form, it will start checking conditions on transition arrows. If it finds a suitable condition, for example, back, it will follow the corresponding transition. If it doesn't find anything, it will follow the default transition. Note that there may be a situation when there are several suitable transitions, in which case the process will follow all of them at the same time. So please be careful when configuring the process and use this approach responsibly because it may increase the likelihood of an error. Another way you can configure transitions is using gateways: data-based exclusive gateway, parallel gateway, and inclusive gateway. These gateways allow for creating a more convenient and readable diagram. Save changes in the process. Delete the old process instance so that only relevant data is used, and test the process configuration in the form runner. In the form runner, select a client from the table and click Next. We have moved to the second form with 2 buttons. Here, for example, click Back. As you can see, we have returned to the first form. Let's see what's going on in the Application Designer in the meantime. Select the current process instance and double-click on it to view the details. Right now, we are staying on the first form, and we can see what values are stored in process attributes. The result process attribute has the value back, and the client process attribute stores the client that was selected from the table. If we click Next in the form runner, the process instance will move to the next block in the process diagram. No process attributes have been modified, therefore the values have remained the same. If we click Complete, the result attribute will take the value complete, and the process instance will finish its execution. And this brings us to the end of the video. In this video, we have learned to bind process attributes to form attributes to provide data exchange between processes and forms, and to configure conditional transitions between process blocks. You can find information about working with other application objects in the previous and following lectures. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you next time.